Marine Corporal Sarah Mitchell had always been the toughest soldier in her unit. At 24, she had already served 2 tours in Afghanistan and volunteered for Iraq when most people were trying to get home. Her fellow Marines called her Steel because nothing seemed to break her spirit. She came from a small town in Ohio where her father worked in a factory and her mother cleaned houses to make ends meet. Sarah joined the military not for glory or adventure, but because her family needed the money and she wanted to serve her country. The morning of October 15th started like any other day in. The sun rose over the dusty streets, casting long shadows between the damaged buildings. Sarah's squad was assigned to patrol the Western District, an area known for insurgent activity. Intelligence reports suggested that enemy fighters were using abandoned houses to store weapons and plan attacks on coalition forces. It was dangerous work, but Sarah and her team had done it dozens of times before. Sarah checked her gear one final time before heading out. Her rifle was clean, her body armor secure, and her radio working perfectly. She carried extra ammunition, medical supplies, and a photograph of her younger brother Tommy in her breast pocket. Tommy was only 16 and looked up to Sarah more than anyone else in the world. She had promised him she would come home safely, and she intended to keep that promise. The patrol consisted of 8 Marines moving through the narrow streets in 2 teams. Sarah led the second team, following about 50 meters behind the first group. The plan was simple: search 3 suspected buildings, gather any intelligence they could find, and return to base before the afternoon heat became unbearable. Local informants had reported seeing armed men entering one of the buildings during the night, but the information was several hours old. As they approached the first building, everything seemed normal. Children played in the dusty streets while their mothers hung laundry on rooftops. Shop owners swept debris from their doorways and prepared for another day of trying to make a living in a war zone. The normalcy was almost comforting, but Sarah had learned never to trust appearances in. The enemy was skilled at blending into civilian areas and striking when soldiers least expected it. The first building search went smoothly. The structure was empty except for some old furniture and trash left behind by previous occupants. Sarah's team found no weapons, no signs of recent activity, and no evidence that insurgents had been using the location. They marked it as clear and moved toward the second target building, a 2-story structure with boarded windows and a partially collapsed roof. Private Johnson, the youngest member of Sarah's team, seemed nervous as they approached the second building. It was his first deployment, and despite weeks of training, the reality of combat patrols still made him anxious. Sarah noticed his hands shaking slightly as he checked his weapon and decided to keep him close during the search. She had been in his position once and knew that experience was the only cure for fear. The second building also appeared empty, but Sarah sensed something different about it. There were fresh footprints in the dust near the entrance, and she could smell cigarette smoke that seemed too recent to be from the previous day. She signaled for her team to be extra careful as they entered the ground floor. The building had been a family home before the war, with faded photographs still hanging on some walls and children's toys scattered in corners. They searched room by room, finding nothing suspicious on the ground floor. Sarah decided to take Johnson and Corporal Martinez upstairs while the rest of her team secured the main entrance and watched for any signs of trouble. The staircase creaked under their weight, and sunlight filtered through holes in the roof, creating patches of brightness in the otherwise dark interior. The upstairs rooms were mostly empty, but in the last bedroom, Sarah found something that made her heart race. There were fresh prayer rugs on the floor, recently used food containers, and most importantly, oil stains where weapons had been cleaned. The insurgents had definitely been using this building, but the question was whether they were still nearby or had already moved to a new location. Sarah immediately radioed the information back to her squad leader and requested permission to search the surrounding area. Intelligence like this was valuable, and if they could track down the weapons cache or capture some of the fighters, it could save American lives in future operations. Her request was approved, but she was ordered to be extremely careful and to call for backup if she encountered any resistance. As Sarah and her team prepared to leave the building and expand their search, she felt a strange sensation, like someone was watching them. She had learned to trust these instincts during her previous deployments, and they had saved her life more than once. She signaled for her team to move slowly and stay alert as they descended the staircase and prepared to exit the building. The moment they stepped outside, Sarah knew they were in trouble. The street that had been busy with civilians just minutes earlier was now completely empty. Shop owners had suddenly disappeared, Children had vanished from their play areas, and even the stray dogs that usually roamed the neighborhood were nowhere to be seen. In Iraq, when civilians disappeared quickly, it usually meant an attack was about to happen. Sarah tried to radio for immediate support, but before she could complete her transmission, the first shots rang out from multiple directions. The insurgents had set up a carefully planned ambush, using the building search as an opportunity to trap the Marines in a crossfire. Sarah and her team dove for cover behind a damaged car as bullets began flying from rooftops and windows all around them. The ambush erupted with terrifying intensity. Bullets ricocheted off the concrete walls around Sarah and her team as they scrambled for better cover. The insurgents had positioned themselves in at least 4 different buildings, creating a deadly crossfire that made movement extremely dangerous. Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of AK-47s mixed with heavier machine gun fire, indicating that this was not a small group of fighters, but a well-organized unit with serious firepower. Private Johnson was breathing heavily behind the damaged car, his eyes wide with fear. This was far more intense than anything they had experienced in training, and Sarah could see that he was struggling to process what was happening. She grabbed his shoulder and looked directly into his eyes, speaking in a calm but firm voice that cut through the chaos of gunfire and shouting. "Johnson, listen to me. You're going to be fine, but I need you to focus. When I give the signal, we're going to move to that doorway about 20 feet to our left. You stay low, follow me exactly, and don't stop moving until we reach cover. Do you understand?" Johnson nodded, though his hands were still shaking as he gripped his rifle. Corporal Martinez was already returning fire from the other side of their makeshift cover, trying to identify the enemy positions and buy them time to plan their next move. He was a veteran of 3 deployments and knew how to stay calm under pressure, but even he could see that they were badly outnumbered and the insurgents had chosen their ambush site perfectly, and the Marines were trapped in what military tacticians call a kill zone. Sarah managed to establish radio contact with her squad leader and quickly explained their situation. Help was on the way, but it would take at least 15 minutes for reinforcements to reach their location. In a firefight like this, 15 minutes might as well be 15 hours. She knew they had to find a way to survive on their own until backup arrived, and that meant getting out of the kill zone as quickly as possible. The first move was the most dangerous. Sarah counted to 3 and then sprinted toward the doorway with Johnson right behind her. Bullets struck the ground around their feet and chipped pieces of concrete from the walls, but they made it to cover without being hit. Martinez followed a few seconds later, running in a zigzag pattern that made him harder to target. They were now in a slightly better position, but still far from safe. From their new position, Sarah could see muzzle flashes coming from at least 6 different windows in the surrounding buildings. The insurgents were using the elevation advantage to rain down fire on the street level, and they seemed to have an unlimited supply of ammunition. Worse yet, some of them were starting to move to new positions, trying to surround the Marines completely and cut off any escape routes. Sarah made a tactical decision that probably saved their lives. Instead of trying to fight their way out through the street, she decided to move through the buildings themselves. It was risky because they didn't know the layout and could easily walk into another ambush, but staying in the open was certain death. She explained the plan quickly to Martinez and Johnson, emphasizing that they needed to move fast and stay together. They shot the lock off a nearby door and rushed into what appeared to be an abandoned shop. The interior was dark and filled with debris, but it provided temporary shelter from the gunfire outside. Sarah could hear the insurgents shouting to each other in Arabic, coordinating their movements and trying to predict where the Marines would go next. She knew they only had a few minutes before the enemy figured out their location. Moving through the building was like navigating a maze in the dark. Sarah led the way with her rifle ready, checking every corner and doorway for potential threats. The building connected to the one next door through a hole that had been blasted in the wall during previous fighting, giving them a route that kept them out of sight from the street-level ambush. In the second building, they discovered something that changed everything. There were weapons caches in several rooms, including rocket-propelled grenades, improvised explosive devices, and enough ammunition to supply a small army. This wasn't just a random ambush. They had stumbled into a major insurgent stronghold that was being used to plan and execute attacks throughout the region. Sarah immediately radioed the discovery to headquarters, while Martinez and Johnson kept watch at the windows. The intelligence value of this find was enormous, but their immediate priority was still survival. The insurgents outside were becoming more aggressive, and Sarah could hear footsteps on the roof above them, indicating that the enemy was trying to get into the building. The sound of helicopters in the distance gave them hope, but Sarah knew that air support couldn't do much in this situation without risking civilian casualties. The insurgents were deliberately fighting from populated areas, making it impossible for the helicopters to use their heavy weapons. The Marines would have to hold their position and wait for ground reinforcements to fight their way through the ambush. Johnson spotted movement in the building across the street and took his first shot of the combat. His bullet struck an insurgent who was trying to set up a rocket-propelled grenade launcher, sending the man tumbling backward and disrupting what could have been a devastating attack on their position. For a moment, Johnson looked surprised at his own success, but Sarah nodded approvingly and told him to keep watching that window. The firefight continued for what felt like hours, but was actually only about 20 minutes. Sarah's team was running low on ammunition, and she knew they couldn't hold their position much longer. The insurgents were getting bolder, and some of them were starting to move through the buildings just as the Marines had done, trying to get close enough for a final assault. That's when disaster struck. A rocket-propelled grenade hit the wall just outside their window, sending chunks of concrete and metal flying through the air like shrapnel. The explosion was deafening, and for several seconds, Sarah couldn't hear anything except a high-pitched ringing in her ears. When her vision cleared, she saw that Johnson had been hit by debris and was bleeding from a head wound. Martinez was also injured, with metal fragments embedded in his left arm, but he was still able to fight. Sarah herself felt pain in her ribs where a piece of concrete had struck her, but she ignored it and focused on getting her team to safety. They couldn't stay in this building any longer. It was only a matter of time before the insurgents overran their position or brought down the entire structure with explosives. Sarah made the decision to attempt a fighting retreat to a more defensible position. There was a police station about 3 blocks away that had been reinforced by coalition forces and should have a radio powerful enough to coordinate their rescue. Getting there would mean crossing open ground under fire, but staying where they were was no longer an option. As they prepared to move, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of American weapons firing from somewhere nearby. The reinforcements had arrived and were fighting their way through the ambush from the opposite direction. This was their chance to break out, but they had to move immediately before the insurgents realized what was happening and shifted their focus to the approaching rescue force. Sarah helped Johnson to his feet and made sure Martinez could still handle his weapon despite his injured arm. The 3 Marines prepared for what might be their final sprint to safety, knowing that everything depended on the next few minutes. The sounds of battle were getting closer from both directions, and Sarah realized they were about to be caught in the middle of a much larger firefight than the one they had been trying to escape. The rescue attempt turned into an even deadlier situation than the original ambush. As Sarah and her team prepared to move toward the sound of approaching American forces, the insurgents realized they were about to be caught between 2 groups of Marines. Instead of retreating, they chose to make a desperate last stand, bringing out their heaviest weapons and turning the entire neighborhood into a war zone. Sarah could hear the distinct sound of a .50 caliber machine gun opening up from somewhere nearby, followed by the explosions of multiple grenades. The reinforcements were fighting hard to reach them, but they were encountering much heavier resistance than anyone had expected. What had started as a simple rescue mission was becoming a major battle that would likely draw in additional units from both sides. The building they were hiding in shook violently as another rocket-propelled grenade struck somewhere nearby. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling, and Sarah realized they couldn't wait any longer for the situation to stabilize. Johnson was getting weaker from his head wound, and Martinez was losing blood from the metal fragments in his arm. If they stayed put much longer, they might not have the strength to move at all. Sarah made a split-second decision that demonstrated the kind of leadership that had earned her the respect of every Marine she had ever served with. Instead of trying to reach the reinforcements by moving toward the sound of fighting, she decided to take her team in the opposite direction, toward what appeared to be a temporary gap in the insurgent positions. It was risky because it meant moving away from potential rescue, but it might be their only chance to find a safe position to wait out the battle. They moved quickly through the damaged building, staying low and avoiding the windows where sniper fire was still a constant threat. Sarah led the way, her rifle ready and her eyes constantly scanning for any sign of enemy movement. Behind her, Martinez helped Johnson walk while keeping his own weapon pointed toward their rear, watching for anyone who might be following them through the building. The route Sarah chose took them through what had once been a small market area. The stalls were empty and damaged, with scattered merchandise and broken glass covering the ground. It was eerily quiet compared to the intense gunfire they could still hear from the direction they had come, but Sarah knew that quiet could be just as dangerous as noise in a combat situation. They were halfway across the market area when Sarah's worst fears came true. A group of insurgents had anticipated their movement and set up a secondary ambush in the buildings overlooking the market. The first shots came without warning, and Sarah felt a burning sensation in her left shoulder as a bullet grazed her. She immediately pushed Johnson and Martinez behind an overturned vendor cart and began returning fire toward the muzzle flashes. This new firefight was different from the first one. There were fewer insurgents, but they were in better positions and seemed more determined to prevent the Marines from escaping. Sarah realized that some of these fighters might be foreign volunteers who had come to Iraq specifically to kill American soldiers, making them more likely to fight to the death rather than retreat when the situation turned against them. Martinez, despite his wounded arm, proved his worth as a combat veteran by identifying and engaging two insurgent positions that Sarah hadn't spotted. His accurate rifle fire forced the enemy fighters to keep their heads down and gave the team a few precious seconds to plan their next move. Johnson, though still bleeding and disoriented, managed to provide covering fire while Sarah assessed their tactical situation. Sarah counted at least 4 insurgent positions in the buildings around the market, and she could see that more fighters were moving to join the ambush. Her team was running dangerously low on ammunition, and they were still at least 2 blocks away from the police station that had been their original destination. The sounds of the main battle were getting fainter, which could mean either that the reinforcements were winning or that they were being pushed back. The decision Sarah made next would haunt her for the rest of her life, though she would never regret it. She realized that Johnson was too badly hurt to continue moving quickly, and Martinez was weakening from blood loss. If all 3 of them tried to escape together, there was a good chance that none of them would make it. But if someone created a diversion to draw the insurgents' attention, the other 2 might have a chance to reach safety. Sarah began preparing for what military personnel call a covering action. Essentially, a one-person assault designed to draw enemy fire away from retreating friendly forces. She gave Martinez her extra ammunition and told him exactly which route to take to reach the police station. She explained that once she started her diversion, he would have maybe 2 minutes to get Johnson to safety before the insurgents realized what was happening. Martinez immediately understood what Sarah was planning and tried to argue with her. He insisted that they should stay together and find another way out, but Sarah was firm in her decision. She had been the team leader, and getting her Marines to safety was her responsibility. Besides, someone had to stay behind to destroy the weapons cache they had discovered, preventing the insurgents from using those weapons against other American forces in the future. Johnson, despite his injuries, also protested Sarah's plan. He argued that he could still fight and that they should all stick together no matter what happened. But Sarah could see that he was barely conscious and would probably collapse within the next few minutes. There was no time for a long discussion. They had to act immediately while they still had the element of surprise. Sarah prepared her remaining grenades and checked her rifle one final time. She had exactly 43 rounds of ammunition left, which would have to be enough to keep the insurgents busy while Martinez and Johnson escaped. She also had a thermite grenade that could be used to destroy the weapons cache, ensuring that her sacrifice would serve a larger purpose in the war effort. The covering action began with Sarah throwing 2 grenades toward the largest concentration of insurgent fighters, followed immediately by rapid rifle fire directed at every muzzle flash she could see. The sudden intensity of her assault caught the insurgents off guard and caused them to focus all their attention on her position, exactly as she had planned. In the confusion, Martinez was able to help Johnson move toward the edge of the market area without being detected. Sarah's one-woman assault was devastating in its effectiveness. Her years of training and combat experience allowed her to move from position to position within the market area, engaging multiple targets and keeping the insurgents confused about how many Marines they were actually fighting. For several minutes, it seemed like her plan might work perfectly. But the insurgents quickly realized what was happening and began to coordinate their response. Instead of just returning fire, they started moving to surround Sarah's position and cut off any possibility of her own escape. She found herself trapped in the center of the market area with enemy fighters closing in from all directions and her ammunition running dangerously low. Sarah's last radio transmission was heard by both Martinez and the reinforcement units that were still fighting their way through the neighborhood. Her voice was calm and professional as she reported that Martinez and Johnson were clear and provided the exact location of the weapons cache for future reference. She made no mention of her own desperate situation, focusing entirely on the mission and the safety of her fellow Marines. The end came suddenly and violently. Sarah had been moving between vendor stalls and using the market's layout to stay one step ahead of the insurgents, but eventually they managed to predict her movements and set up a coordinated ambush. Multiple fighters opened fire simultaneously from positions that gave her no cover and no escape route. Sarah was hit 11 times in a matter of seconds. The bullet struck her chest, abdomen, arms, and legs, sending her crashing to the ground behind an overturned fruit cart. The insurgents, thinking she was dead, moved on to search for other Marines and try to prevent the reinforcements from reaching the weapons cache. They left Sarah bleeding in the dust, assuming that no one could survive that many gunshot wounds. But Sarah Mitchell was not dead. Despite the massive trauma to her body, she remained conscious and aware of her surroundings. She could hear the insurgents talking nearby and the distant sound of American helicopters searching for survivors. Using willpower, that medical explanation, she managed to drag herself into a small storage room beneath one of the vendor stalls, where she would remain hidden for the next 2 days. The storage room beneath the vendor stall was barely large enough for Sarah's body, measuring only about 4 feet by 6 feet with a ceiling so low she couldn't sit upright. It had probably been used to store produce before the war, but now it was filled with rotting debris and had a smell that made breathing difficult even for someone not suffering from multiple gunshot wounds. Sarah had managed to pull herself into this space using only her arms, as her legs were no longer responding to her commands. The first few hours were the worst. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness as her body tried to cope with the massive trauma. She could feel blood pooling beneath her and knew that she was losing more with each heartbeat. The pain was unlike anything she had ever experienced, but somehow her mind remained clear enough to assess her situation and think about survival. Sarah still had her basic medical kit, though reaching it required movements that sent waves of agony through her entire body. She managed to apply pressure bandages to the wounds she could reach and used her combat knife to cut strips of cloth from her uniform to create makeshift tourniquets. The medical training that every Marine receives had taught her that controlling bleeding was the most important factor in surviving serious injuries, and she focused on that goal with the same determination she had shown throughout her military career. Sounds of battle continued overhead for several more hours. Sarah could hear American helicopters circling the area and the distinctive sound of Marine Corps vehicles moving through nearby streets. She knew that search and rescue teams were looking for her, but she also knew that the insurgents were still active in the area and would prevent any thorough search efforts. Several times she heard footsteps directly above her hiding place, but whether they belonged to friends or enemies was impossible to determine. By the second day, Sarah's condition had deteriorated significantly. She had developed a fever from infection, and some of her wounds had reopened despite her attempts at field treatment. Her water supply consisted of a single canteen that was now nearly empty, and she had no food at all. More seriously, she was beginning to experience symptoms that suggested internal bleeding, including dizziness and a rapid heartbeat that she could feel pounding in her chest. The psychological challenges were almost as difficult as the physical ones. Sarah knew that every hour she remained undiscovered reduced her chances of survival, but she also knew that calling out or using her radio could easily attract insurgents instead of rescuers. The area was still contested, with sporadic gunfire indicating that enemy fighters remained active. She had to balance her desperate need for rescue against the possibility that revealing her location could result in her capture or execution. During the long hours of waiting, Sarah's thoughts turned to her family back home in Ohio. She thought about her brother Tommy and the promise she had made to return safely. She thought about her parents, who had worried about her decision to join the Marines but had supported her anyway because they knew it was what she wanted. She thought about the letter she had written before this deployment, to be delivered to her family if she didn't make it home. Sarah also thought about Martinez and Johnson, hoping desperately that her sacrifice had allowed them to reach safety. The last thing she remembered clearly was hearing Martinez's voice on the radio confirming that they had reached friendly forces. But in her current state, she couldn't be certain whether that memory was real or something her mind had created to cope with the situation. The sounds of the search efforts continued throughout both days, sometimes growing closer and sometimes fading into the distance. Sarah could hear Marines calling her name and the voices of officers coordinating the search grid. On several occasions, she heard movement directly above her hiding place and had to fight the overwhelming urge to call out, knowing that insurgents might also be moving through the area and searching for wounded Americans. By the end of the second day, Sarah was barely conscious most of the time. Her fever had worsened, and she was experiencing hallucinations brought on by blood loss and dehydration. Sometimes she thought she could hear her brother's voice calling to her, or imagined that she was back home in Ohio helping her mother with household chores. The line between reality and imagination became increasingly blurred as her condition deteriorated. During one of her brief periods of clarity, Sarah managed to check her watch and realized that she had been missing for more than 48 hours. She knew that standard search protocols would typically call for scaling back rescue efforts after that much time, especially in a hostile area where continuing operations put additional lives at risk. The possibility that she might be declared dead and left behind filled her with a terror that was worse than the physical pain. Sarah made a conscious decision to stay alive long enough to be found, no matter what it required. She began rationing her remaining water even more strictly, taking only tiny sips when the thirst became absolutely unbearable. She forced herself to stay awake as much as possible, knowing that falling into unconsciousness might be permanent in her weakened state. Most importantly, she began making small noises whenever she heard movement above, hopping to attract attention without giving away her exact location. The area around the market had become a focal point for military operations beyond just the search for Sarah. Intelligence analysts had determined that the weapons cache she had discovered was part of a larger insurgent network, and additional units had been deployed to search for more hidden supplies. This increased activity gave Sarah hope, as it meant that American forces would continue operating in the area for several more days. On the evening of the second day, Sarah heard something that made her heart race with hope. The distinctive sound of Navy SEAL communications equipment was clearly audible from somewhere nearby. SEALs were known for their expertise in personnel recovery operations, and their presence suggested that the military was making a serious effort to find her. She had worked with SEAL units during previous deployments and knew that they had capabilities and determination that went far beyond standard search and rescue teams. Sarah mustered every bit of strength she had left and began tapping on the wooden floor of her hiding place with the handle of her combat knife. The sound was barely audible, but in the relative quiet of evening, she hoped it might be enough to attract attention from anyone searching nearby. She tapped out a simple SOS pattern that any military person would recognize, repeating it over and over until exhaustion forced her to stop. The effort of signaling drained what little energy Sarah had remaining, and she collapsed back onto the floor of her tiny hiding place. Her breathing was becoming increasingly labored, and she could feel her heartbeat becoming irregular. She knew that she was running out of time and that this might be her last chance to be found alive. As consciousness began to fade again, she continued tapping weakly with her knife, determined to keep signaling until she physically couldn't continue. Unknown to Sarah, her tapping had been heard. A SEAL team conducting a methodical search of the market area had detected the faint SOS signal and was now moving carefully toward its source. They had to proceed slowly and quietly because insurgent snipers were still active in some of the surrounding buildings, but they were getting closer to Sarah's location with each passing minute. The SEALs had been searching for Sarah for more than 36 hours, following every lead and checking every possible hiding place in an expanding grid pattern around the site of the original firefight. They had found evidence of the battle, including blood trails and spent ammunition, but no sign of Sarah herself. The discovery of her tapping signal was the first real indication they had received that she might still be alive. As the second day drew to a close, Sarah's condition was critical, but her spirit remained unbroken. She had survived longer than anyone thought possible with her injuries, and rescue was now only minutes away. The most dangerous part of her ordeal was nearly over, but the most challenging part, surviving long enough to reach proper medical care, was just beginning. The SEAL team that found Sarah was led by Chief Petty Officer, a veteran of dozens of combat operations who had earned a reputation for never leaving anyone behind, had been part of the search effort since the first reports of Sarah's disappearance, and he had personally insisted that the team continue looking even when other units were being reassigned to different missions. Something about Sarah's story had touched him deeply, perhaps because he also had a younger sibling who looked up to him the way Tommy looked up to Sarah. When first heard the faint tapping signal, he immediately recognized it as an SOS pattern. He signaled for his team to stop moving and listened carefully, trying to determine the exact location of the sound. The market area was still dangerous, with at least 2 confirmed sniper positions in nearby buildings, but knew that they might only have one chance to reach whoever was making that signal. The rescue itself was a masterpiece of special operations tactics. His team used smoke grenades to obscure the sniper's vision, while 2 SEALs approached the source of the tapping sound. They moved in short rushes, using the damaged vendor stalls for cover and communicating through hand signals to avoid giving away their positions to any insurgents who might still be hiding in the area. Petty Officer First Class Jennifer was the first to locate the entrance to Sarah's hiding place, was one of the few female SEALs in combat operations, and had volunteered for this mission because she knew that finding a wounded female Marine would require special medical considerations that male medics might not fully understand. When found the small trapdoor hidden beneath debris and rotting fruit, she could hardly believe that anyone could have survived in such a cramped space for more than 2 days. His first glimpse of Sarah was shocking even for someone accustomed to combat casualties. Sarah was unconscious, covered in blood, and so pale that she looked almost dead, but could see the slight rise and fall of her chest and immediately called for the team's medical specialist while beginning her own assessment of Sarah's condition. The fact that Sarah had survived this long with such severe injuries was nothing short of miraculous. Getting Sarah out of the storage room required careful planning and precise execution. The space was too small for multiple people, and moving someone with such severe injuries risked causing additional damage that could be fatal. Had to crawl into the cramped space and carefully examine each of Sarah's wounds before attempting to move her, all while remaining alert for any signs of insurgent activity that could endanger the entire rescue operation. The initial medical assessment revealed the full extent of Sarah's injuries. She had been hit by 11 bullets, resulting in wounds to her chest, abdomen, both arms, and both legs. Several of the bullets had passed completely through her body, while others remained lodged against bones or vital organs. She had lost an enormous amount of blood and was showing signs of severe dehydration and infection. By all medical logic, she should have died within hours of being shot. Coordinated the extraction while worked to stabilize Sarah for transport. The team's medic, Hospital Corpsman Second Class David, had to perform several emergency medical procedures right there in the market area while under potential sniper fire. Managed to establish an intravenous line and began administering fluids and antibiotics that Sarah desperately needed to have any chance of surviving the helicopter flight to the nearest trauma center. The helicopter extraction was complicated by the fact that the landing zone was still under insurgent observation. Had to coordinate with air support units to suppress potential threats while the medical helicopter approached the market area. The pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Lisa, demonstrated exceptional skill by landing in a space barely large enough for her aircraft while taking occasional small arms fire from distant positions. Sarah regained consciousness briefly during the helicopter flight and was able to speak a few words too, who was monitoring her vital signs throughout the 20-minute flight to the forward surgical hospital. Sarah's first words were questions about Martinez and Johnson, demonstrating that even in her critical condition, her primary concern was still the welfare of her fellow Marines. Was able to assure her that both men had been rescued and were receiving medical treatment for their injuries. The trauma team at the forward surgical hospital was led by Major Williams, a surgeon who had already treated hundreds of combat casualties during her deployment in Iraq. When Sarah arrived, Major Williams immediately recognized that they were dealing with injuries that would challenge even the most experienced trauma specialists. Sarah required immediate surgery to address internal bleeding and remove bullet fragments that were threatening vital organs. The first surgery lasted more than 6 hours and required the expertise of multiple specialists working simultaneously. Sarah's condition was so unstable that the medical team had to stop the operation twice to address complications that threatened her life. At one point, Her heart stopped beating for nearly 2 minutes before the medical team was able to restore a normal rhythm and continue with the life-saving procedures. Sarah's recovery would ultimately require 7 more surgeries over the following 3 weeks, as doctors worked to repair damage to her liver, intestines, and major blood vessels. She also developed several serious infections that had to be treated with powerful antibiotics, and there were times when her family was told to prepare for the possibility that she might not survive. But Sarah's determination to live proved stronger than any of her medical challenges. The story of Sarah's rescue and recovery became legendary throughout the Marine Corps and the broader military community. Her 2-day survival in the storage room was studied by medical professionals trying to understand how the human body could endure such trauma. Her selfless actions in covering the retreat of her fellow Marines earned her recommendations for several high-level decorations, including the Silver Star for gallantry in action. Martinez and Johnson both recovered fully from their injuries and returned to active duty. They never forgot Sarah's sacrifice and visited her regularly during her long hospitalization and rehabilitation. Martinez eventually became a sergeant and named his first daughter Sarah in honor of the Marine who had saved his life. Johnson overcame his initial fear and became one of the most effective Marines in his unit, crediting Sarah's example with teaching him the true meaning of courage and leadership. Chief and his SEAL team were also recognized for their exceptional performance during the search and rescue operation. Later said that finding Sarah alive was one of the most rewarding moments of his entire military career. The bonds formed during those critical hours created friendships that would last for decades, with and both staying in touch with Sarah throughout her recovery and beyond. Sarah eventually returned to duty after almost a year of medical treatment and rehabilitation, though she was assigned to training duties rather than combat operations. She used her experience to help prepare other Marines for the realities of combat, emphasizing the importance of never giving up and always looking out for fellow service members. Her story became part of Marine Corps training curriculum, inspiring thousands of young Marines to understand what true leadership and sacrifice really mean. Years later, Sarah would often reflect on those 2 days in the storage room beneath the vendor stall. She never considered herself a hero, insisting that she had simply done what any Marine would do in the same situation. But her example of courage, determination, and selfless service became a defining moment not just in her own life, but in the lives of everyone who knew her story. The young woman from Ohio who had joined the military to help her family had become a symbol of everything that makes the American military special, proving that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they refuse to surrender in the face of impossible odds.